Chapter 6, we'll be talking about the aerobic adaptations to endurance training. So in here, we'll be looking at the cardiovascular, the respiratory, and the musculature adaptations to performing aerobic training. Biggest things on here is, remember, with cardiovascular, the factor we're looking at is the cardiac output, primarily looking at stroke volume, the amount of blood being injected from the heart per beat. Okay, that's the biggest, one of the most important aspects to overall cardiac output and cardiovascular fitness is looking at how much blood is being injected out. Because I was looking at two things, volume, along with then the overall efficiency of the heart. How strong is the heart? How well is it contracting each beat? Okay, so when you're looking at cardiovascular fitness, you're looking at then, well, one, the cardiac output, so the stroke volume factors, and also then the AVO2 difference. And so when you're looking at that, you're looking at then VO2, okay, maximal oxygen uptake. Because remember the Fick equation, VO2 is equal to heart rate times stroke volume times AVO2 difference. And you're looking at aerobic performance, those are the factors physiologically we're looking at and going to be most important about. Like I said, primarily stroke volume and also then AVO2 difference, how well is oxygen uptake into the cells, and then how well is it able to be used. Look at respiratory factors, how's breathing altered during training. And then musculature, well, musculature changes in the fact that you become more aerobic. You get a lot more of the capabilities, the enzymatic activities, the mitochondria, and so forth. And then finally, we'll finish up with overtraining. You'll see definitely with aerobic endurance, overtraining is a huge probability just due to the amount of volume and the amount of work that most aerobic athletes are going through during a training regimen. Okay, so pay attention to some of those things we'll talk about there, the definitions, the important factors, and the overall what is getting better the more we do aerobic, the more we aerobic train, the more endurance programs we partake in, and like what really is being impacted and being changed through that type of training. Chapter 6, Adaptations to Aerobic Endurance Training Programs. The objectives, 1, to identify and describe the acute response of the cardiovascular and respiratory systems to aerobic exercise. Because remember, when you're dealing with endurance training, it's going to be the main system being taxed that is going to be the cardiovascular. Okay, just like anaerobic training is going to be a lot of skeletal muscle stresses, this is going to be the cardiovascular system being the primary one being taxed. Identify and describe the impact of chronic aerobic endurance training on the physiological characteristics of the cardiovascular, respiratory, nervous, muscle, bone, connective tissues, as well as the endocrine. Recognize the interaction between designing aerobic endurance training and optimizing physiological responses of all body systems. Identify and describe the external factors that influence adaptations to acute and chronic aerobic exercise. And recognize the cause, signs, symptoms, and effects of overtraining and detraining. Key terms, you got the cardiac output, which we should all know by now, but once again, is stroke volume multiplied by heart rate. And that is the amount of blood pumped by the heart in liters per minute. Stroke volume, once again, is the quantity of blood ejected with each beat. Arguably, I would say stroke volume is the most important factor when you're looking at cardiac output. And overall, going back to the Fick equation, heart rate times stroke volume times AVO2 difference. And if you're looking at generally, which is what sums up cardiovascular endurance and looking at cardiovascular physiology in terms of exercise, we're looking at those three factors in the Fick because that's VO2 equals heart rate by stroke volume by AVO2 difference. Stroke volume is going to be the most important factor because, yes, it is the quantity of blood ejected with each beat, but really with stroke volume, the amount of blood being injected out is going to be completely reliant upon the overall efficiency of the heart. The stronger the heart, the larger the heart, the better the heart actually can do its job, that is pumping blood, means more blood ejected per beat, which then means to maintain certain levels of cardiac output, the heart rate doesn't have to go up high to match those cardiac output demands. So because the stroke volume is higher, so therefore heart rate can be maintained a lot better. That's why those who are trained can do one workout at a lower heart rate than those who are untrained, because those who are trained have a greater stroke volume. So stroke volume is the most important factor when you're looking at the overall cardiovascular system in a lot of ways, because it's looking at how well is blood being ejected out of the heart. Okay, you got maximal oxygen uptakes, or VO2 max. It's the greatest amount of oxygen that can be used at the cellular level for the entire body. And when you're looking at your VO2, you're looking at the relationship between the cardiovascular and the metabolic systems, and how well oxygen can be uptaken to keep all systems operating at a given workload. When you're looking at FIC, once again, remember FIC is VO2 by heart rate, stroke volume, AVO2 difference, or cardiac output by AVO2 difference. So, and really, once again, the VO2 is looking at the overall, how well is oxygen being consumed at the cellular level, which does take into account both the cardiovascular and the metabolic systems. We have a resting oxygen uptake. So this is estimated to be about 3.5 milliliters of oxygen per kg per minute. This is defined as one metabolic equivalent, so 1 MET. We'll use that as another term to describe the overall difficulty of different workouts based upon METs, because the higher the METs means the higher the oxygen demands for that given workload. So you got acute responses. So the cardiac output says from rest to steady state aerobic exercise, cardiac output initially increases rapidly, then more gradually and subsequently reaches a plateau. So cardiac output, heart rate, systolic blood pressure, all those will increase linearly with intensity. Okay, and if everything intensity plateaus out, then all these other factors will plateau out as well. It says with maximal exercise, cardiac output may increase to 4 times the resting level. And stroke volume, also known as end-diastolic volume, because it's the amount of blood in the left ventricle to end the diastole. That becomes important because the next part after diastole comes then blood being injected out into the system. So that's going to become significantly increased during exercise just due to more blood needing to be injected out to maintain cardiac output demands. So at the onset of exercise, sympathetic stimulation is increasing stroke volume. Release of your catecholamines will then stimulate contractility, so it starts making the heart beat a lot stronger, which will then allow for greater blood to be ejected on out. These are not training adaptations. These are just essentially what's happening during exercise just to keep maintaining cardiac output demands. It says heart rate increases linearly with increased intensity. I've already said that. And an oxygen uptake. It says increases during an acute bout of aerobic exercise. It says it's directly related to the mass of exercise and muscle, metabolic efficiency, and exercise intensity. When you're looking at metabolic efficiency, you're looking at how much mitochondria do you have, what's the enzymes, pathways. All of that is going to then directly relate to how much oxygen can be uptaken at that given time. Now that's oxygen uptake is a training adaptation. The more you train, just like stroke volume, both of those, the more you train, the better they become, so the more they can handle the given stress at a given workload. Heart rate's not something you necessarily, heart rate, I always say this, those who have effects phys will remember me saying this, but think of heart rate as like the artillery on the battlefield. It's sending in air support, helping out those on the ground when needed. So wherever stroke volume, oxygen uptake are lacking, heart rate will increase to maintain that given level of output. And so what happens with training, we'll see come up in the slides, is that as stroke volume gets better, our oxygen uptake gets better, heart rate doesn't have to rise as much to maintain those cardiac demands. You got blood pressure. So systolic estimates the pressure exerted against the arterial walls as blood is forcibly ejected during ventricular contraction. Okay, that's going to increase during exercise just because you will have a increase in blood volume during exercise. So systolic should go up linearly with intensity. Remember, diastolic is the pressure exerted against the arterial walls when no blood is being forcibly ejected through the vessels. Diastolic should remain during all exercises roughly the same. You shouldn't see a major change in diastolic. Both of these, as we do train, systolic won't rise as much. The more trained we are, it won't rise as much over time because the body can handle given workloads a lot better. Even with training, diastolic, no matter what, diastolic should stay roughly the same. If you ever see an increase in diastolic during exercise, stop immediately because that means no blood's being injected out. Someone could be going into some kind of cardiac event. It says control local circulation. It says during aerobic exercise, blood flow to active muscles considerably increased by the dilation of local arterioles. At the same time, blood flow to other organs is reduced by constriction of the arterioles. So this is a natural the body, once you start to exercise, you'll start to redirect blood flow to those areas that need it while diverting away from areas that do not need the blood. Key points in acute aerobic exercise have an increase in cardiac output, stroke volume, heart rate, oxygen uptake, systolic, blood flow to active muscles, and decreased diastolic blood pressure. So that last one, decreased, why you might see a decrease in diastolic blood pressure is it's not going to be a major decrease, but it might go down some following exercise. And that's just due to the massive increase in basic global vasodilation. So all your vessels will open up globally through the whole body because as you exercise, you're producing heat. And so you start to vasodilate all the vessels to try and get the blood redirected away to try and get the heat dissipated out of the body. And so essentially what happens, you have a decrease just because the vessels are so wide, it's just the pressure will go down. And this is usually always seen during following an exhaustive, decently heavy exercise session. And that's pretty common to see that. You just never want to see a huge increase in diastolic blood pressure. So respiratory responses. So aerobic exercise provides the greatest impact on both oxygen uptake and carbon dioxide production as compared to other types of exercise. Remember, the biggest thing that stimulates in a breathing response is actually the buildup of CO2. Because if you think back metabolically, CO2 gets produced first before O2 is consumed. And CO2 gets produced rapidly, and it takes time for the oxidative system to get kicked into gear. So that's why when you start to exercise, it doesn't take long before you start breathing heavy. And then as you continue on, then you notice the breathing kind of levels out. It still is raised, of course, but it's leveled out given that you're doing some kind of steady state exercise, just because then the CO2 production, oxygen consumption start to balance out. But initially, CO2 production outweighs O2 consumption. That's why you start to breathe really heavy at the start of exercise. And just says during high intensity aerobic exercise, the pressure gradient of oxygen and carbon dioxide causes the movement of gases across cell membranes. And just everything, remember, flows from high to low concentration. Pretty much everything in the body goes across with that rule there. And then blood transport, oxygen's for the most part carried by hemoglobin, about 98% carried by hemoglobin. And then CO2 is removed via bicarbonate. That's the most common way we carry CO2 in the blood back to the lungs is via the production bicarbonate. And then what happens is as CO2 is produced, it gets converted to bicarbonate, transported in the blood, and then in the lungs, it gets converted back to CO2, and then we expire it on out. It says during low to moderate intensity exercise, enough oxygen is available that lactic acid does not accumulate because the removal rate is greater than equal to the production rate. It says though the aerobic exercise level at which lactic acid, so converted to blood lactate at this point, begins to show an increase is termed the onset of blood lactate accumulation, or OBLA. So if we're able to keep maintaining the same intensity for a long period of time, it's a pretty good indicator right there that we're able to match the lactate removal versus lactate production. And the onset of blood lactate accumulation, eventually then lactate threshold, that point where you become solely anaerobic and you start to slow down, That's the point at which lactate accumulation outweighs production. Accumulation outweighs the removal. However, if you're able to maintain, like I said, then you know that the removal and accumulation are balanced out at that point. Once again, training adaptation. The more trained you become, the better you're able to remove what's produced before it starts to accumulate too much. Tidal volume is just normal, it's just amount inspired versus expired, so it's just basically normal breathing, okay, without taking deep breaths in or forcefully expiring out air. It's just tidal volume is our normal breathing, and says this is just distribution in a healthy athlete at rest. You see tidal volume in milliliters for one inspiration, one breath, and once again, this is not a maximal inhalation. This is just a normal. So comprised about 350 milliliters of room air that mixes with, you'll have some alveolar air, and then about 150 milliliters of air in the larger passages, so the anatomical dead space, that's air that doesn't participate at all with gas exchange, and then a small portion of air distributed to either properly ventilated or incompletely filled alveoli. So there's a physiological dead space. So you'll have just basically some dead space that doesn't participate, but then the alveolar air, you'll have, and so when you see that about 150 milliliters of air in the larger passages, so when we inspire, well, let me take this back. Remember that normal atmospheric air is about 79% nitrogen, 21% oxygen, and 0.04% carbon dioxide. And so we breathe in 21% oxygen, but then we expire out about 16% oxygen. So what happens is gas exchange only takes about 7% of the air we actually participate with and actually can consume, and we really don't actually use all 21% that we breathe in of oxygen. Only about 7%. And then we expire out about 16% actually. And what happens is that we, use about 7%, but then the leftover mixes with some of that anatomical dead space, and so we then expire out a little bit. But the dead air space, both of them, they don't actually, what I mean by not with gas exchange is that none of the oxygen in that dead space we actually are consuming ourselves and going in and be able to use. Okay, that some of that dead space will mix within the air in our lungs, but it's not actually helping out. It's not like we have a reserve little space in our lungs for oxygen. There's just air there that we never actually can tap into, and so when we breathe in, some of the air we breathe in as we're breathing out will mix with that dead space. But once again, the only air that we actually consume, it, like I said, in that alveolar air is just enough. It's just about that 7% is all we could actually use with that gas exchange. Once again, the pressure gradients, lungs, and or the tissues, it's always going from high to low concentration. It says during aerobic exercise, it says large amounts of oxygen diffuse from the capillaries into the tissues. It says increased levels of carbon dioxide move from the blood into the alveoli. Minute ventilation increases to maintain appropriate alveolar concentrations of these gases. And so as we just breathe, as the air comes into our lungs, you see the blue at the top, says from the pulmonary artery. We've got that lower partial pressure of oxygen. And then in the lungs, it's higher. So then once again, the diffusion from high to low. And then we got our rich blood supply, the partial pressure of oxygen's gone up once it leaves the heart, and then it goes to the tissues where, once again, the tissues are low in concentration of oxygen, so the high concentration of oxygen in the blood will diffuse then into the tissues. Biggest thing to remember when you're looking at the gradients here is it's the most important factor is always going to be partial pressure over saturation level first. Because partial pressure of a gas will then determine saturation rates. Okay, so in the lungs, the partial pressure of oxygen is high, and then that drives then the saturation of the hemoglobin. So because the partial pressure is high in the lungs, it will then allow for the saturation of hemoglobin to take place, the increase and have it fully saturated. Okay, so it's not saturation doesn't matter. It's always partial pressure will then determine saturation. I shouldn't say saturation doesn't matter, but hope you can understand what I mean is that if you want to have fully saturated tissues, especially the hemoglobin, you need to have a high partial pressure first. That will drive then the saturation levels. And you see minute ventilation. So that's tidal volume times frequency. So that basically means breathing rate. And so you says it'll increase and maintain appropriate concentration of the gases. Well, there's a reason why you start to breathe more during exercise, because you got to maintain that proper concentrations. So therefore, breathing will increase to maintain that proper amount of concentrations for the tissues. So now the chronic adaptations. So increases in maximal cardiac output, stroke volume, and then the one thing we haven't talked about, fiber capillary density. As you train more, you start doing more cardiovascular training, you'll get a greater density, which just means a greater circulation of blood, or availability for the circulation of blood. You get an increased parasympathetic tone, which leads to a decrease in resting submax heart rates. And so that's a good thing, because that means if the heart rates are lower at rest and then submax, it means the overall heart's working better. So you per beat, you have a lot more blood being injected out. So you have a greater stroke volume. Respiratory adaptations. It says ventilatory adaptations are highly specific to activities that involve the type of exercise used in training. And this includes increased tidal volume and breathing frequency with maximal exercise. And of course, neural adaptations, so you get efficiency is increased and fatigue of the contractile mechanism is delayed. So looking specifically at, you'll see the increase in contractile of the heart. And of course, the skeletal muscles as well. You won't have as much byproducts being built up in the local tissue level, so therefore you're not going to have that build up, and you could whatever's being built, you could clear out right away. And so you won't have that major reflex to try and, because a lot of times we have to clear out those byproducts, that's what's slowing you down. And so you have to clear them out. Once they're cleared out, then you can maintain at the rate you once were at. But what happens is they build up. So you have reflex, you have mechanical receptors in the muscles, you have chemoreceptors, mechanical telling movement. And so it sends the signal to the body saying, hey, we're moving, redirect blood. But then you have the chemoreceptors being, responding to lactate, ammonia, hydrogen buildup, and other acids. And so those are signaling, hey, we have this chemical buildup. We got to get some blood here to help clear everything out. Okay, so what happens as you train aerobically, well, one, you get a greater, blood being injected out. And then that fiber density means you just have greater ability to distribute blood to all tissues a lot more effectively. And then what is being built up, you're not having these reflexes sending back to the brain saying we need more blood. It's just the body can handle at the given tissue level what's being built up, and it can handle the stress, a lot greater stress for a longer period of time before it does start to have to shut down. So within the muscular adaptations, one of the biggest things it says is aerobic capacity of the trained musculature, meaning greater mitochondria content, more enzymes, more pathways. So it can handle, the muscles could handle the stress once again now, just due to it's not producing much byproducts. It's able to consume the oxygen a lot better because it has the ability to do that. More mitochondria, denser mitochondria, enzymatic activity, pathways, and so forth. And then bone and connective tissues, so mature adults, the extent to which tendons, ligaments, and cartilage grow and become stronger is proportional to the intensity of the exercise stimulus. It says especially from weight-bearing activities. You got endocrine adaptations. This leads to hormonal circulation and changes at the receptor level. Okay, once again, some things like catecholamines, you'll notice the more aerobically trained you are, the less catecholamines will be released. They're still going to because they stimulate heart rate, breathing, blood flow, and all that. But the amount being released is not going to be as great just due to the training status. You can handle the given workload without having this massive redistribution of hormones to try and get the body back to normal. And as for all the other hormones, well, once again, going back to the first units talking about glycogen and content, the more trained you become, the more you spare glycogen and the more you're able to use other fuels like fat for fuel. So whenever you're doing that and you're sparing that glycogen, you're not having the huge hormone release, because remember, major thing hormones do is they help to maintain a proper glucose level. And so if you're sparing glycogen, not using it up as much, you're not going to need these hormones being released because you could handle the given workload by using the available fuel. That is fats, along with then the aerobic capacity. All these coming together allows you to then, like I said, spare that glycogen and use other fuel sources, so you don't need the hormones being released to basically get the body back to normal. One of the most commonly measured adaptations to aerobic endurance training is the increase in maximal oxygen uptake. That's VO2 max, associated with the increase in maximal cardiac output. Once again, the reason why that VO2 max is going up is because big part of it is you're getting an increase in stroke volume. You're getting a greater ability to eject blood, a stronger heart, more blood volume, larger heart, all that allowing for a greater stroke volume, which allows then to have that greater oxygen capacity. Of course, intensity is one of the most important factors improving and maintaining aerobic power. That means if you want to see the greatest changes, you need to do as high training as you possibly can for. This really comes into intensity and duration during a workout. Be able to train at the highest intensity for a long period of time. That will see the biggest changes in your overall VO2 max factors. You can see the other endurance training results. You see reduced body fat, increased VO2, increased running economy, increased respiratory capacity, lower blood lactate concentrations. That's due in part to, once again, you're not using up all your glycogen and able to use fats. And you're able to do that because the next part, increased mitochondria and capillary densities, and along with enzymatic activities. Some other factors are going to influence aerobic endurance training. Altitude is going to be one of the biggest ones. And you'll see changes above 3,900 feet. So at that point, you'll see an increase in pulmonary ventilation during exercise, and as well as an increased cardiac output or rest and submax exercise. And it's not your cardiac output. This is one thing about this. Your cardiac output is not going up because it's a training adaptation. Cardiac output's going up because you're having an increase in heart rate. So one of the biggest things you get at altitude is well, first, altitude training does not add any performance benefit because you can't train at the same intensity that you were able to at lower elevations. And so you'll notice at altitude, some of the biggest things you'll notice is the increased breathing, increased heart rate. And problem is the heart rate has to go up because stroke volume's going down. Because at altitude, you see a decrease in blood volume, which then decreases plasma volume, which then plasma volume will go down, then blood volume, which then stroke volume is going down. And so when you get there, that's why you can't train at the same intensity. You fatigue out way faster than you would at lower elevations. Now, they're not long lasting. It says values begin to return normal within 2 weeks. It says several chronic physiological and metabolic adjustments occur during prolonged altitude exposure, which is true. But these are more or less not training benefits. These are along the lines of keeping you alive. So you see long-term adjustments in the table right here. But if you look through them, you'll notice decreased stroke volume at rest and submax and maximal exercise, which means if your stroke volume's going down, well, you'll have a decrease also. Going to the next ones, you can see through there, you'll have a decrease in AVO2 difference. Reason why is because when at altitude, you're dealing in a hypoxic environment, lower oxygen availability, so therefore AVO2 difference will go down. So by that, then your max VO2 will go down as well. Just because you see the bottom says increased capillary density, increased number of mitochondria, a lot of that is not necessarily a training adaptation so much as more along the lines of you're getting more of those, you get more of those not tissues, they're more of those parts of the cell, the mitochondria and all that. My brain went blank right there, for survival mechanism. Okay, due to lower oxygen availability, you'll get some more mitochondria and enzymes, but that's just that way you could handle what little oxygen is available, essentially. And so everyone thinks you go to altitude and you get a training adaptation, but you don't. You get it's a detraining at best. Okay, a lot of these things are actually more or less just to keep you alive and keep you going, as opposed to actually helping you become better at your sports. And this is for aerobic sports, I should say. Anaerobic sports doesn't matter, throwing, sprinting, things of that nature, not a problem at all. Some other factors influencing, you got hyperoxic breathing. So this would be the opposite. So this is breathing oxygen-enriched gas mixtures during rest periods or following exercise may positively affect exercise performance. Research is still controversial on there, but this would be the opposite of being at altitude. This would be breathing super rich oxygen. Of course, smoking, we all know that impairs performance, so that should be a no-brainer there. Blood doping does help out. If you know what blood doping is where endurance athletes will pull out a certain amount of blood. They will spin the blood down, separate the plasma from the red blood cells. Then they'll just save the red blood cells. They'll discard the plasma, but they'll save the red blood cells, freeze them, keep training, and then before certain time before an event, they'll inject the red blood cells back into their system. And so that way they go into their event with as much red blood cells as possible. Obviously, that's unethical because that's a form of cheating. There are serious health risks with that, but it is outlawed for pretty much, it's definitely Olympics is outlawed. This is Tour de France. This is one of the things that got the Tour de France in a lot of trouble. All the cyclists, Lance Armstrong, they are taking other supplements as well. EPO, erythropoietin, which stimulates red blood cell growth. So these are all factors that are unethical and are not outlawed, or they're outlawed by all these agencies. And you got genetic potential. So the upper limit of individual's genetic potential dictates the absolute magnitude of the training adaptation. Okay, I know recently, in the last few years, runner broke the 2-hour marathon. Well, if you look at his genetic ability was definitely an elite status. In terms of VO2 max, I don't think he had the highest VO2 max ever recorded. In terms of runners, the highest VO2 max recorded is with cross-country skiers, but he didn't have the highest in terms of marathon runners. But Nike pumped in a big old bunch of money into this and gave him the best training, the best shoes. They had the track with the least resistance, all that, which did help out, obviously, break the 2-hour marathon. But what happened, he said, with the runner, I think his name was Kachobi, who broke the 2-hour marathon, he just had that, well, he just had the gift. He had the genetics. He had just a body built for endurance running and also the mindset built for that as well. But nonetheless, because of his genetic ability, he was able to reach that upper limit of aerobic adaptations. Unlike somebody who's an Olympic lifter, will never get to that point no matter how much they run. It says age and sex. Maximal aerobic power decreases with age in adults. Aerobic power values of women range from 73 to 85% of values of men. Reason being is just because men are larger, we have bigger hearts, more blood volume, a greater AVO2 difference capabilities. So because of that, that's why men will always have, if you're looking just the best male versus the best female, males will always be better than the females just due to those physiological differences. But doesn't mean that women cannot have better than some men. You know, if you're not an aerobic athlete, any aerobic trained female will have a much greater aerobic capability than the non-aerobic training male. So now the response is going to be similar in men and women. Those who just start training aerobically can see the very similar responses. And so, but this is just looking at, if you're comparing the top male versus the top female, just due to physiology, the physiological differences, males will always be better than the females just due to the, like I said, the greater heart, larger blood volume, greater AVO2 difference, and so forth. Okay, last little bit here. Overtraining. It says greater volumes of training affect heart rate. So you'll see that if athletes start to get a higher than normal heart rate, then that could be a sign of overtraining. You'll see a greater response in muscle breakdown, and we see increased levels of creatine kinase. Creatine kinase is a marker of muscle damage. So if you start to see that in the blood, start to appear quite a bit, that's a great indicator that there is some muscle damage more than it should be taking place. And you see a greater loss of muscle glycogen with prolonged periods of overtraining. I see with endocrine response, decreased testosterone to cortisol ratio, decreased secretion of growth hormone, and changes in catecholamine levels. That changes in catecholamine levels goes back to the first one, heart rate, because catecholamines stimulate heart rate. And so if you start to see it higher than normal heart rate, then, and also, see the muscle glycogen decrease, those are all signals that there's something out of whack with the endocrine response. And it says overtraining syndrome can lead to dramatic performance decreases in all athletes. Okay, and all the endurance athletes, and this is where you will see probably good signs, a lot of overtraining just because of the amount of volume of training that endurance athletes tend to put themselves through. And it's that day in, day out, just a constant high volume with very little recovery will then really speed up the overtraining response. Here's all the markers of aerobic overtraining, ones we all talked about, but just once again, just all of them listed out. Very similar, though, to anaerobic overtraining as well. You got detraining. It says inactivity rather than proper recovery follows exercise and athletes loses training adaptations. And so with detraining, you could see that, after 1 week of no training at all, you can see about 50% decrease in metabolic activity. You can see a 25% decrease in heart size. After a month of detraining, about 50% loss in heart size. So you see some major effects from detraining. And you should never detrain at all. Even if you start to get into overtraining a little bit, it's better to reduce intensity, reduce volume, but still maintain some training than to stop completely. Because you never want to get to that point where you detrain, because then you lose everything so fast. And so proper recovery amongst all athletic events would be to every so often throw in some kind of reduced intensity week, sometimes called a deloading week. Like I said in the anaerobic section, maybe if you're if you're lifting every fourth week, do your routine, but do it only to 75% of what you do during the previous 3 weeks. For endurance, depends on how long you're running. Well, the best thing to do is just cut back the amount of mileage or cut back the amount of sessions or something along those lines. That where you're still getting some training in, but you're reducing the intensity a lot to allow the body to start to recover. You get tapering. And so tapering is a little bit different because it says a planned reduction of volume in training that occurs before an athletic competition or a planned recovery microcycle. So a lot of times the tapering is that as you get closer to the competition, you'll start to maintain high intensity, but then you'll reduce the volume. And you'll keep the intensity high, so getting that stimulus that way, but reducing the volume that way, when you're ready to go into competition, you're peaked out as much as you possibly can. And of course, proper exercise, variation, intensity, maintenance programs, and active recovery periods can adequately protect against serious detraining effects. And this is where a good strength coach comes into play, making sure that know your athletes, know their needs, and know how to really manipulate these variables to keep your athletes from getting injured, because that's your number one goal as a strength coach. Don't get your athletes injured. Oh, there it is again. I just put that bolded just to highlight the fact that as a strength coach, that is your goal, is to protect against any kind of serious effects. Okay, and this is why strength coaching, like they say, is an art form, because the more you know your athletes, the more you know their needs, more you can protect them, help them out from getting injured. And you can still get some great adaptations by only doing training twice a week than doing 5 days a week, given you give it the right exercise selection and intensity. So for instead of detraining where you stop training, the best thing would be, hey, just like have your athletes, they need some time to recover. Give a week, maybe just 2 days a week they're coming in. Every third day, just come in for a hard, intense session, and that's it. It's still going to stimulate growth. And if it's during recovery time, the body recovery should be thought of as just as important as actual training. Okay, you got to allow your body a certain amount of time to recover. If not, you're not going to be able to allow for those adaptations. Okay, so for the strength coaches, make sure you know your needs of your athletes and know how to manipulate to keep them making progress without getting them injured, and allow for their recovery to set in to help them, like I said, to keep making the progress and keep going, getting stronger. And once again, your number one goal as a strength coach is don't get your athletes injured. To conclude this chapter, just like I said in the intro and through the lectures, make sure you know what goes into aerobic endurance. That is, how's the heart change? Well, we get a greater stroke volume, more blood, stronger heart, larger heart. What about the AVO2 difference? Well, as the muscles become trained, we get more of those pathways, the oxidative pathways, enzymes, mitochondria density, and so forth. So just make sure you know all those adaptations that happen through aerobic training, and just keep those in mind. That the more we do, well, be careful, because in order to get the adaptations, you really need to train at a high enough intensity, long enough durations. Problem is, overtraining does become a serious probability just due to the amount of training that aerobic type activities do put on the body. Okay, so overtraining does become more of a true probability within this type of training as opposed to maybe some other ones. Okay, so this is something where you really need to put in recovery time, rest times, adequate, deloading type weeks where you're cutting back on the intensity, or maybe cutting back just an amount of frequency through the week. Planning this all out so you keep your athletes healthy, because that's the most important, is making sure your athletes stay healthy and not let them get hurt. Okay, so that's why the strength coach really needs to know their athletes and know how to get the most out of them without putting them under too much stress where you could bring about an overtraining type situation. Okay, so just remember all we talked about in here, the definitions and major concepts, what changes through aerobic training, what are the benefits, the physiological changes, and the problems that could come about with too much over a given amount of time.